There's a lot of pressure when you choose the keynote speaker for your conference. They should be someone who reflects the values of the conference, challenges attendees to think beyond the known, and inspire lots and lots and lots of questions. We were delighted then when Professor Chuck Friedman accepted our invitation. Chuck is the Josiah Macy Junior Professor and Chair of the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School. Chuck's keynote address today invites us to envision a national learning health system and how this might bridge the gaps in healthcare in Australia. Welcome, Chuck.
Well, thank you. It's really just wonderful to be here. We are delighted. My spouse who spoke yesterday, Professor Abbott, and I are delighted to take credit for bringing the rain to Australia. She has been here 3 times, and it has rained very significantly on all 3 occasions, most significantly on this one. And I was with her on the past trip. So I have now been here twice, and clearly we are very pleased to see the end of the fires. I wanted to, before I launch into my slides and the main part of my talk, pick up on a theme that Melanie introduced in her remarks. I'm going to be talking to you about what has turned into a big idea, and that's big with a capital B and I with a capital I, this idea of a learning health system. When I first became exposed to this idea over 10 years ago, I had a deep intuitive sense that this was a big idea, but of course you can have an intuitive sense of something and have your intuitive sense prove to be not the case in the end. Well, this idea of a learning health system has turned into a big idea and increasingly into a big reality, as I am going to hope to convince you. But I want to go beyond that. I looked at the picture of haze from the fires here in Australia. And I want to challenge you to think about, as you hear about these ideas applied to health and some very specific methods and approaches to improvement of health described here, how that may be applied to other problems that our society faces. I'm directly involved now in applying these ideas to education, to improve education, but I think the ideas are even more transcendent than that. So as I talk about a learning health system to improve health, let me challenge you to think about other problems that we all face and how these same methods could be applied to those as well. So the journey this morning will have 3 major parts to it. First, I will try to describe what a learning health system is, and I'll come at this from many different directions. And then I'm going to try to answer a question which, if I didn't try to answer it, you would almost certainly ask, and that is, there are a lot of approaches to improving things in the world around today and to improving health in particular. What makes this approach different from other approaches? And I'm going to focus on 3 specific ways that this approach differs. And then I'm really going to go out on a ledge. And I'm going to speculate how a learning health system for the entire country might be achieved. I'm not sure if you use IMHO here, but that stands for in my humble opinion, and I will put the emphasis on humble as I go forward with this. This is a mandatory disclosure that I do serve on the board of a not-for-profit that has a mission very, very similar to the things I'll be talking about today. So, what is a learning health system? You can read a lot about them. You can read a lot about them looking at the lower left of the slide, in a series of monographs and books that have been put forward by the U.S. National Academy of Medicine. All of these are available on the web. And then, going forward to the shameless commerce part of this talk, you can also read about them in a journal called Learning Health Systems, very creatively titled, published by John Wiley, but edited at the University of Michigan. And this is a journal entirely open source, entirely devoted to the theme of learning health systems. A very concise, but I think helpful definition of a learning health system is seen at the top of the slide, that a health system at any level of scale, and we're going to come back to this issue of scale, can become a learning health system when it acquires the ability continuously and routinely to improve health through discovery and implementation. Sure, we can do that. And we're going to talk about how this might be done. In the US, we have an unfortunate clash of terminology, very, very common in anything having to do with informatics. And I just want to establish from the outset that what I am talking about here is not learning health care systems as they are currently referred to, as what I'm talking about today is commonly referred to, but rather learning health systems. We are about, at least I will be talking about, improving health, individual health, population health, and not improving health care per se. Improving care certainly improves health, but the idea of a learning health system is much broader, at least as I construe it, than improving care. Now, we're very fond of anthems in the United States, and you see on the bottom of the slide a picture reminding us all that we had our own problems with the Pommies a few centuries ago. They actually, during the War of 1812, sailed into Baltimore Harbor and bombarded Fort McHenry. Actually, we have a house in Baltimore, and we can see Fort McHenry from the roof of our house. If the house had been around and we had been around in 1814, we would have seen this scene. And it was during this event and the fact that the British bombardment was unsuccessful and the flag still shone in the morning after the bombardment that was the inspiration for our national anthem. So we're big on anthems. I'm going to try to help you begin to understand what the basic idea of a learning health system is by suggesting a few anthems. I've been challenged over the years to put these to music, but if any of you are musically inclined and would like to send me some music, I will offer a reward for a successful submission. Anthem number one, bring us to tough problems. Learning health systems are about not incremental improvement, but very significant, large-scale system improvement against problems that are very, very significant and very, very challenging. So we're not talking here about gently nudging the needle. We're talking about moving the needle to a degree and to a level that will make a big difference. Second anthem, a system problem needs a system solution. For those of you who are familiar with the Paul Simon song, "One Man's Ceiling is Another Man's Floor," that's kind of close to putting this to music, but not quite. What this suggests is that these tough problems are invariably system problems, and they're very complicated, and a lot of people believe that we can fix these tough problems by fixing the people. We can't do that. The system problems cannot be solved by fixing the people, by changing the people. The people usually aren't the problem. We have an excellent, dedicated health workforce. They probably don't need fixing. We need to do more. So we need system solutions to system problems. And the third anthem is 17 years to 17 months, and maybe 17 weeks to 17 days to 17 hours. And what this refers to is an unacceptable latency, gap in time, that has been well established, even though there's some disagreement about whether it's 17 years, 12 years, 20 years, it's a lot of years. That is the gap between the discovery of new knowledge that can improve health and its widespread implementation in our society, in care and beyond. So one of the goals of the learning health system is to shorten this latency, again, coming back to this big idea, not by a year or two, but by whole orders of time magnitude, from years to months to weeks to days, and maybe even into hours in the case of a public health emergencies, such as we're seeing with the coronavirus now, where a learning health system might be able to detect a problem and react to it in a matter of hours, which could be the difference between a global outbreak and the effective containment of that before it becomes a global outbreak. So, the goal, as the definition suggested, is a system that can improve health through discovery and implementation. So, if we had a learning health system, and here's another way of thinking about it, what would it look like if an inspector walked into a health system, a health organization, a health improvement organization, and had a clipboard and had on it a checklist of things that that inspector was looking for to see if that health system was a learning health system? What would that person have on the clipboard? Well, one is that every participating person's relevant characteristics and experiences are captured as data to learn from. Do we record, does this system record what happens, and do they record it in a way that is amenable to analysis? We're going to call this data to knowledge in a moment. Checklist item 2. Is the best practice knowledge that is determined from analyses of this routinely captured data available to people who have to make decisions to support those decisions? And these people are not only providers, they could be patients themselves, care recipients, they could be administrators and managers, they could be lots of different kinds of people. And we will call this knowledge to performance. Does this health system do this continuously and in an enduring way through ongoing cyclic activity? Lots of places can become learning health systems or look like learning health systems when threatened with extinction or loss of accreditation or other fates worse than death for an organization like this. But a learning health system doesn't just do this when threatened, it does it all the time in the pursuit of continuous improvement. Is there an infrastructure that enables this to happen routinely and with economy of scale? Infrastructure is very important to learning health systems, and we'll return to this. And finally, all of this is part of the culture of the organization. And what I mean by this is, let's suppose this hypothetical inspector starts walking around and asking people why they do this. I've learned you do all these 4 things above, but why do you do this? If this is part of the culture, they really won't be able to tell you. They'll just say, well, this is who we are, and this is what we do here. This is nothing special. So this is a way of thinking about what a health system that has become a learning health system will look like. To give you the gestalt of the LHS from another perspective, I've just pulled the keywords out of that checklist. People, learning, data, knowledge, rapidity, performance, continuous and enduring, cyclic activity, infrastructure, and culture. We'll return to all of these points. But if you want sort of a quick snapshot, a kind of wordle of what a learning health system is, you can think about these words. Scale. One of the very appealing, for many, many reasons, aspects of learning health systems is that they can exist at any level of scale, and no matter what level of scale at which they exist, they pretty much work the same way and do the same things. So single organizations, large and small, can become learning health systems. Networks of otherwise independent organizations can come together and form learning health systems, usually around specific diseases or categories of diseases. States, provinces, regions, jurisdictionally defined areas can become learning health systems. Geography quiz, does anybody recognize this body of land? You can't answer. That's Michigan, that's where we live. Nations can become learning health systems, as I will conjecture toward the end of this talk. Does anybody recognize this nation? Europe was neutral during World War II. Mountains, cheese. Switzerland, thank you. And then finally, there are those dreamers who think we might achieve a global learning health system one day by taking advantage of the fact that these learning health systems at lower levels of scale are similar to one another, function the same way, which makes it possible to think about how we might scale up from learning health systems at lower levels of scale to ones at higher levels of scale. Okay, so what does a learning health system do? What do you actually do to improve things? And what you do to improve things on a learning health system is undertake community-directed cycles of study and change, as the slide suggests. And the process begins at the lower right with the formation of what we call a learning community. We'll return to this. This is a absolutely essential beginning step. This is a multi-stakeholder group that shares a passion for solving the problem, whatever the health problem of interest is, whatever the area of improvement is, where improvement is being sought. Then there are 3 stages of the learning cycle, what we call performance to data. In the first initiation of performance to data, you capture practice as data. You study what's happening now, and you establish the metrics against which progress in the future is going to be judged. Then you enter D to K, or data to knowledge, where data relevant to what is being done are collected and analyzed, and results are generated, which could be suggestive of how to improve. This is then combined with external evidence, because for almost any problem that is important, there will be others not part of this learning community who have studied it as well. So there's a junction here where the data that is locally, the results that are locally developed are combined with literature and other evidence that exists in the world. And these come together at 12 o'clock on the cycle, where the results are interpreted by the community, and the community decides, well, have we learned enough to suggest that we actually do something to improve against this problem of interest? And if the answer is yes, the cycle proceeds to the 3rd stage, which is knowledge to performance. Some kind of intervention is designed. It could be one intervention that every participating entity in the cycle will implement, or it could be multiple different interventions. It could even be an A versus B versus C randomized experiment. This could be set up as a formal trial. Action is then taken. This intervention is implemented either in one way or in multiple ways. And that brings us back to performance to data, where this change system is studied. The metrics that were determined on the first cycle are assessed, and it is seen whether performance occurred, whether improvement occurred, and if improvement occurred, where did it occur and why. This takes the process into a next cycle where the process is repeated, with the idea that over successive cycles, continuing improvement will occur. So to make this a little more concrete, we can look at an example of a very deep and significant problem that I believe is universal. How do you prevent falls of elderly residents of nursing homes? Well, this problem would begin with formation of a learning community, and here we encounter this issue of scale. Who's in this community? What's going to be the scope of this effort? Is this going to be all of the nursing homes in a city? Is this going to be all the nursing homes that, as we have in the US, that are run by one company? Is this going to be a self-organizing volunteer group of nursing homes? But this community will form, and the scope of the membership of the learning community will define the scope of this effort. And they will capture practices data. They will study what happens now, what is the fall rate and severity, which could take to be the metrics of primary interest to measure improvement. These data will be captured from all participating nursing homes and assembled into a form amenable to analysis. What happens now in these various places will be related to lower fall rates. External evidence, voluminous external evidence from other places will be incorporated, and the community will come together and say, as it relates to our community, to our needs, to our participating nursing homes, what have we learned both from our own studies of our own practice and from external evidence, and what interventions are indicated. The community will then design interventions. Who receives it? How will it be implemented? What will it be? And do we do an experiment? Do we do it all one way, or do we intentionally build a comparison into this? We then take action which will change current practice in whole and part, which then brings us back to the initiation of the second part, the second cycle. Data on changed practice will be captured. What happens now will be different from what happened before. How much improvement occurred? What can we relate the improvement to? And how do we go forward in successive cycles for further improvement? A key aspect of this cyclic process is that the community that discovers is also the community that implements. The same community follows the entire cycle around. And as such, better health occurs, improvement against the problem occurs from successive cyclic action, P to D to D to K to K to P. I've gotten really good at saying that, to P to D to D to K to P. Take home point. Better health requires these complete cycles, and not what I and many others, and probably many of you in this room, were trained to do in graduate school. And that is collect some data, analyze it, generate new knowledge, publish that knowledge in a journal, and go on to collect more data about some new problem, repeating this D to K process over and over again on the assumption, and it's typically not a valid assumption, that there's somebody there waiting to take this knowledge and put it into practice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, most of the time, at least in the US, there's no one there. There's no one home. And that's why, primarily, we have this multi-year latency between discovery and its appearance in journals and the widespread applications of this. So learning health systems preach this and not just this. I'm not saying we shouldn't do research and publish. What I'm saying is we have to be sure that when something is published and it's valuable, it goes directly into practice. And using this learning community idea, where the community that discovers is also the community that implements, is a way to ensure that that will happen. And we also don't want this. It's what I call the open circuit problem. So at many institutions, there are a lot of people doing health services research. converting data to knowledge. And there are other people in the so-called quality department whose job it is to take knowledge and put it into practice. But these are different people, different groups of people, and they don't talk to each other, and they have different approaches and different values. So what you see on this slide depicts yet another thing the learning health system avoids by having this continuity of a learning community that closes that cycle. The same people who take the data to knowledge, who do the discovery, take the knowledge back to practice. This is one slide that could be a whole talk, and this is basically my assertion to you that the learning health system is a big idea and it's catching on, not only in the US where it originated, but really increasingly around the world. We have exemplars of learning health systems in the US at the single organization level. People point to Intermountain Health, to Geisinger Health in Pennsylvania, to Kaiser Permanente, the Mayo Clinic, and even our Veterans Administration hospital system as examples of entities that have successfully implemented this learning health system approach. Networks are growing in the US faster than anyone can keep track of this. Our Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute is increasingly becoming the Patient-Centered Outcome Research and Implementation Institute, taking what they initially funded as research networks and making them into improvement networks. There's a National Cancer Link Learning Health System project. Our National Institutes of Health are just beginning to fund learning health system efforts focused on specific diseases. We see states, provinces, and regions in Canada. It's very interesting to watch what's happening in Quebec and British Columbia. We have 2 statewide initiatives that I know of in the US. And then nationally, I've mentioned Switzerland, which has the only nationally government-funded learning health system initiative. It's a country of 9 million people. So maybe the scale of that is more like one state in the United States. In the UK and Scotland and England, there are increasingly emerging learning health system initiatives. So I hope that first part of my talk brought home the general idea of what a learning health system is and what its general characteristics are. Now I'm going to very quickly try to convince you that this really is different from all the other improvement methods that are around and that are being implemented in various places, certainly in this country and around the world. The first is embraced uncertainty. System problems are complex problems, and it is axiomatic to the learning health system approach that this learning community, when it comes together, doesn't know what to do. So this initiates that first part of the learning cycle, which engages P to D and D to K, taking performance to data and analyzing it with the intent of identifying in a data-driven way how improvement against this problem might occur. And in point of fact, there are open questions at all 3 stages of the cycle. What's happening now at P to D? How should we change from D to K? And how should these changes be implemented in K to P? So you can think about this another way as where the cycle starts. If you really don't know what you're going to do when you begin your quest for improvement, you need to start at what I'm calling 5 o'clock on the cycle, right here, beginning by studying what you're doing now. There are a lot of improvement processes that begin at 12 o'clock, which is not the learning health system approach. If you're starting at 12 o'clock, either this community has been told what to do, we are going to implement the X method or the Y method, or has made what I call an evidence-free decision. Without collecting data, they have decided, well, let's just try this and see if it works. So a learning health system approach is differentiated by a kind of insistence that the improvement process start at 5 o'clock on the assumption that the problem is complex enough, a system problem, a hard problem, that it isn't clear what to do to improve. The second is infrastructure, big differentiator. I talked about the learning health system as consisting of these learning cycles, and a learning health system can consist, a learning process can be addressing multiple problems with multiple cycles going on at the same time. I would submit to you that does not create a learning system. And to think about this principle of infrastructure, think about a city that has a lot of water, like the one we're in now. And in a city with a lot of water, you have to get people across the water in large numbers every day. And there are kind of two ways of doing this. You can give everybody a hammer, nails, some wood, some glue, and then I don't know what else, and say, okay, build your own rowboat and row yourself across. Or you can build a bridge. I trust this is a familiar bridge. I've seen this bridge somewhere before. Obviously, an infrastructural approach is the bridge, and not that everyone can share, and not giving everybody their own rowboat. So how do you apply this idea? And I apologize, this is kind of an abstract figure, but it really is important and summarizes a lot of the points that I'm going to make. You can envision a learning health system not as a disconnected, freestanding, co-occurring set of learning cycles, each addressing its own problem, but rather a co-occurring set of learning cycles, all supported by a common infrastructure, providing services that all of these learning cycles share. And this works because even though each of these learning cycles is addressing its own problem at its own pace, they're all basically doing the same thing. They're doing the P to D green thing, the D to K blue thing, and the K to P red thing. And because they're all doing the same thing, in the same way that people who are crossing the bay are all doing the same thing, they all can share these common services, just like all of the people who want to get from one side of the bay, from the harbor to the other, can share a bridge. Why is this important? Well, in a nutshell, if you don't have an infrastructure, this ain't going to work. It ain't going to work because without an infrastructural platform, every learning cycle is going to require its own agreements, technology, staffing, analytics, dissemination of mechanisms. I'm no economist, but I know enough economics to know that this has no economy of scale. And the cost of running 10 of these cycles is going to be exactly equal to 10 times the cost of doing one. But with an infrastructural platform, which I represented as this ring underneath, all of the learning cycles are supported by this common infrastructure. There is big economy of scale, and the cost of doing 10 cycles is far, far less than the cost of doing one. And suddenly we see how we can do a learning health system in a way that is scalable and sustainable. And another point I want to make that I didn't make before is that if you look at this ring on the bottom representing the supporting infrastructure, it's not just technology. A lot of people think, oh, well, we got an EHR, we got a lot of computers, so we've got a learning health system. No. The infrastructure supporting a learning health system is a socio-technical infrastructure consisting of people, policies, processes, and technology. And unless you take this particular interpretation, the infrastructure will not be complete and will not support all of the things these learning cycles need to do. Now, to look at this infrastructure point, because it's so fundamental in more detail, let's take a look down on this ring to see what it consists of. So if you look down on this ring, what you will see is an infrastructure, and I don't have the time to dwell on this. This too is a talk in and of itself, of 8 kinds of interconnected socio-technical policy, technology, people services. But if you just stare at what these are for a second, you will see that these services can support learning cycles that address any problem whatsoever relating to health. So they are generic services that can be, once put in place, supportive of multiple learning cycles to achieve a necessary economy of scale. So you probably looked at this and said, oh my God, what are we going to do? We got to build all this before we can achieve a learning health system. Well, the good news is a lot of people, whether intentionally to support a learning health system or not, or for other reasons, have built infrastructural services that most of which are open source and can be pulled off the shelf and implemented very, very quickly. The good news here is that many of these infrastructure components needed to support the infrastructure, needed to comprise the infrastructure supporting learning health systems already exist. So that's infrastructure. Then learning communities, the third differentiator of learning health systems from other approaches. I want to tip my hat to my good friend and colleague, Peter Margolis at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, who really has not only acquainted me, but completely immersed me in this idea that these learning communities are the key element to making learning health systems work. And this is predicated on the fact that a learning health system is a collaborative socio-technical system. It's not top-down, it's not hierarchical, and the learning communities that drive the system must be all-inclusive, must at least come to the point where all the participants trust each other. They are decentralized, they're reciprocal, everybody puts something in and everybody gets something out, and above all, they are driven by shared passion and curiosity. I have been amazed in my own work with learning health systems how important this is. For any significant health problem, there are providers, patients, and others who are absolutely passionate about solving this problem, either because it's their life's professional goal, or they have this problem, or someone they love has this problem. And I like to think that the fuel of the learning health system is passion to solve the problem as much as it is monetary and other resources. And if you're going to harvest this passion, you can't skip this step. The learning community has to form and be given an opportunity to form before you move on. And somewhat repeating what I said before, these learning communities function as collaboratives, multi-stakeholder, pursuing a shared goal, fueled by passion. The strategies, all of the key decisions are co-produced by members of the community. Leadership is not directive, but rather facilitative, and very, very important when one is trying to develop improvement through learning health system methods. No one group in the learning community can dominate this. This is a very important principle that we actually learned from the formation of Visa, where a fellow named D. Hock managed to basically convince about 8 banks whose principal job in the world was to put each other out of business, that they're all far better off coming together to address this problem of credit card system development. Peter Margolis at Cincinnati Children's Hospital has a wonderful network that has been around for quite a long time called Improve Care Now. I strongly recommend that you go to the Improve Care Now website and look at their video, and you will see how, and here is a kind of improvement that has occurred against a very, very, very difficult problem. They have achieved, working together using the methods I described, where they have taken the remission rate for adolescents and young adults with inflammatory bowel disease from around 50% over a period of 9 years, shown here, to close to 80%. This is not incremental nudging of the needle. This is moving the needle in a very, very big way. And I learned about passion from going to some of the meetings of Improve Care Now, listening to parents who have literally retired from their jobs to work full-time for this organization because they saw their children suffer and they saw their children's conditions improved, and they want to help bring this improvement to others. In Michigan, we're working on a very, very big problem of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. You see the dismal statistics here that right at this time, if you have a cardiac arrest, suddenly out of hospital, your chances of being discharged from the hospital with good neurological function are about 8%. It's a very, very difficult problem. We have formed a learning community, initially scaled to 2 counties in Michigan, forming what we call a medical control district, and we have formed this learning community across the whole chain of survival, from a phone call from a bystander all the way through to admission to the hospital, and every link in that chain has to function perfectly and quickly in order for survival to occur. The American Heart Association has taken interest in this method and has actually funded us to continue the work of this learning community. And I just want to show you what a learning community looks like. This is our out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community, and you can see the multi-stakeholderness of it, just looking at the different kinds of folks and what they're wearing in these pictures. So I hope I convinced you that learning health systems are different. Certainly they share many characteristics with other methods that are in play, that are used to promote improvement. But I think this combination of embraced uncertainty, you don't know at the beginning what you're going to do to solve this problem because it's hard. This idea of infrastructure, shared services, enabling economy of scale, and this idea of learning communities whose passion, multi-stakeholder communities, whose passion work through the entire cycle, ensuring we don't have this short circuit problem, is the third differentiator. So how do I think you might achieve the audacious goal of a learning health system for the entire nation of, I think, 25 million people in Australia? Well, this rests on 10 general principles for starting a learning health system that I've learned over time and that I'll share with you, and also inspiration from other places, including the places I showed you on that slide earlier, and 3 specific steps. I think if you're going to work at national scale, you've got to start at national scale. So think national from the outset, even though everybody in the country does not have to begin working at the outset. Jump in, initiate learning cycles around specific health problems of interest across the country, difficult problems, where it is generally recognized that new approaches may be necessary to move the needle significantly, and build infrastructure that would support the cycles and that can ultimately be deployed at national scale. So I've said that this is a big idea and that it's spreading, and I was very pleased and almost fell back in my chair and hit my head on the floor when I heard about this UK Better Care Partnership being sponsored by Health Data Research UK. And you see in the middle, the words aren't exactly the same, but you see a cyclic thing, very much like what I was describing. We are drawing on the conceptual framework of learning health and care systems that have developed a better care loop, familiar language and familiar concepts. And HDR UK at a national scale is beginning to promote, in effect, a national learning healthcare system, or national learning health system for the UK. It's a start, and if you take a look following the URL at the top of the slide, you will see many features in their program that share what I'm about to describe. So very quickly, the 10 principles and strategies for getting a learning health system started. This is bottom up, not top down. Work from the ground up. Choose to address problems that are important and that people are interested in. Jump in, start some learning cycles. You don't need a complete infrastructure to get started. As we say in the computer business, you can kludge a lot of this. You can kind of piece it together with what you have. Use passion as fuel. There are passionate people out there. The importance of collaboration is self-evident. Early successes can be the driver of further expansion. Don't expand until you have successes to expand on. No one in a learning health system should ever be conscripted to do anything. These are coalitions and activities of the willing. Give each learning community significant leeway to run its own cycle, so they own it and steer it. I've put this in red. Avoid technology paralysis. There are many who say, and I wish I had $10 for everyone who has said this to me, because I'd be rich. We can't do this until we have an EHR fully deployed. Not true. Each learning cycle really needs the data that it needs to address the problem that it's focused on, and it's much more important to have high quality data than anything else. And I also hear, similar to the first plaintiff cry, we can't do this until we have all of our data standardized. And my response to that is, if you really believe this, you won't be able to do this at all, because you will never have all of your data standardized. And I'm sure there are people in the room who resonate with that observation. If you're ultimately hoping to do this at national scale, there should be some national lightweight governance over all the cycles that coordinates them and begins nudging them in the direction of being able to share services from an emergent infrastructure. But while this governance should be lightweight and coordinating and not controlling, it's very important that these different learning cycles that are ongoing share a sense of common purpose and form a community of their own and actually learn from each other. So just in a little more detail, as I bring my conjecture to a close here, working at national scale requires establishing as a core principle that the scale of the effort, and thus ultimately the infrastructure, will be nationwide, and establish this lightweight initial governance that will coordinate the learning cycles that are underway and support the development of the infrastructure. 2, initiate learning cycles, let them form around problems of shared interest. If there is a declaration to begin such an effort at national scale, the declaration, in my opinion, should not contain a preordained set of the health problems, which will be the foci of the initial learning cycles. Let that develop. You've heard about passion too much from me already, but I'll repeat it again. And then form these all stakeholder learning communities for each learning cycle. I would argue that nationwide scope for each cycle is not a requirement at the outset, but scalability to the entire nation could be a whole, could be a goal. A learning cycle could start in one region of the country, and as long as the idea is that it might scale eventually, this does not contradict the idea of having in mind something that would grow to national scale. I want to emphasize that the formation of these all-stakeholder learning communities really does take time. That out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community was 1 year in the making before we really were certain we had a kind of coherent and cohesive group that was ready to move together. Build infrastructure, the shared services that are required for a complete infrastructure are briefly summarized on the slide. We rest here on kind of informatics principles 101. You always want to make use of what you already have, maybe expanding it. You never want to start from the beginning when you can possibly avoid it. I mentioned a number of infrastructural services that exist in the U.S. that probably, almost certainly, can be used here. So import when you can and build when you must. So coming to a close, my summary points: learning health systems marry discovery to implementation. Learning health systems are different because of embraced uncertainty with discovery at all stages of the learning cycle, because of infrastructure with services shared by all cycles. Very important when you're thinking about a learning health system that you think bridges and not rowboats. And then learning communities, being sure that the people who discover are the very same people who are engaged in putting those discoveries into practice. All I can say with regard to my conjectures, IMHO, for how this might be achieved for Australia, I'll be very interested in what you think. And if you think I'm crazy, I hope in the question and answer session you will look me in the eye and tell me that, but also tell me why you think I'm crazy. Some relevant publications. A lot of what you have heard in this talk is summarized in this article called Toward an Information Infrastructure for Global Health Improvement. This idea of how to merge external evidence with internal evidence in a learning cycle is described in this Mind the Gap article. And then I would humbly tell you that everything in the journal Learning Health Systems is relevant to what I was talking about today. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you, and if there's time for questions, I'd be delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. I have lots of questions, but I will throw it to the audience first. We have Ruby and Anne who will be around with microphones.
Thanks, Chuck. I enjoyed that very much. So, I mean, there has been conversation about learning health systems in Australia, and I guess one of the points is, what's the vehicle? If you're going to go national, I mean, how do you get a vehicle to manage that? Because we obviously have splits with our state and federal funding and different organisations. We do have these groups called Advanced or Applied Health Translation Research Centres, ARTECs, and there's been a conversation about, and they're actually combinations between academic centres and clinical centres. So within Sydney Health Partners, it's a combination of the university plus the 3 services that it largely and closely works with. I mean, that seems as a potential vehicle that you could use for that. I guess I'm interested in whether you see this when you go to a national scale, with it being led by the services or being led by the kind of academic community, or a collaboration together.
I think you know how I'm going to answer this. It's important to not leave any key group or stakeholder out of a learning health system initiative. And when I think about this, I fall back on my own physics background, and I think about an atomic nucleus, which is stable when it has a certain number of protons and neutrons. But you take one neutron out, and it falls apart cataclysmically. And I think that's a good metaphor for the importance of including all of the kinds of organizations you're talking about. It seems to me as one thinks conceptually about a learning health system for a whole nation, making it entirely in the academic sphere in its initial incarnation, or entirely in the service sphere in its initial incarnation will inevitably lead to a response that would not be a positive response from the entity that is excluded. So that's without being familiar with the details of the health terrain here in Australia. I realize that's a very high-level answer, and that the problems are probably more daunting than I'm aware of as I give this very high-level response. But do you see specific challenges in doing what I'm talking about?
I guess it's just to see. I mean, I can see it working at an organisational level. That's easy to envisage how that works. And I guess when you even at a jurisdictional level, but when you get bigger, I guess it's what's the vehicle that can carry it to get that initial collaboration. I do think we could look at our RTECs, which are already a collaboration between services and academia, with the focus of being about translations. I mean, I think we might need that kind of catalyst or seed to give her the vehicle to do it. So there's a woman called Alina Teed in Melbourne who's looking at that for Monash Health Partners, for instance. I think that might be an opportunity to kind of vehicle it out, if you like.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that not everybody's got to participate in everything. And a way to look at all inclusiveness is not for each component, each learning cycle, each aspect of infrastructure development, everybody's got to be involved in every one of those things. It's just spanning across the entire effort that it has to be all inclusive.
Hi, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the barriers to uptake and whether or not data privacy features largely in that.
Did you, I'm sorry, I didn't catch all the privacy figures?
Whether or not that features, if that's a significant barrier for uptake.
Sure. So, if you recall on the checklist, way back at the beginning of the talk, I said every participating person's data, and the word participating was consciously included there. And I also said no conscripts, coalitions of the willing. So I think that to the extent that the operations of these learning cycles require data about individuals, that the community has to work in such a way, and the cycle has to work in such a way, that the privacy of the information of the patients particularly is fully respected. At a minimum, there needs to be an opt-out arrangement. The experience in the US, when you do this kind of cyclic operation and it's focused on a particular problem, the opt-out rate is very, very low because of the interest that the patients have in improvement regarding their specific problem, or the interest in the case of children that their parents have. So you can't go charging into this assuming that everyone will agree to be part of it. So you must take appropriate action to respect privacy. But the experience has been very good, at least in the US.
Thank you. Chuck, thank you very much for a great presentation. The only thing I lament is we didn't hear it 10 years ago. It would have probably changed our whole digital health strategy in Australia significantly. My name's George Margellis. I chair the Aged Care Industry Information Technology Council. And one of the things we have at the moment in Australia is a Royal Commission looking at the aged care system and looking at how we can reform the system to improve it. The biggest challenge we face is workforce. So whilst we have lots of passionate people, driving a system by passionate people isn't scalable because those passionate people fall through the gaps, get hit by a bus, or just run out of steam. What do we need to do to our workforce to enable them to do this in a sustainable way? Is it just education? Is it freeing up time for them to run passion projects within a system? Is there some other secret sauce we can do? Because without a workforce enabled to do this, we all have, we come to meetings like this, we talk about it, and then we fail to drive it beyond that. So Your comments on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. By the way, I brought some secret sauce, and I will be selling it in the back along with my CDs. Just kidding. But a really very important point. I think it's important to proceed incrementally with anything like the strategy that I talked about. One of the nice things, to my way of thinking about the strategy I described, is that, to coin a term, it's incrementalizable. You can grow it at the size that you have the resources to support. So you want to be mindful of the importance of the workforce that you need, and you don't want to grow it any faster than the workforce you have. I'm hearing about many very promising initiatives in Australia to build the relevant workforce. I would say the workforce is not just informatics people, the way informatics people are conventionally trained. If I defined, and I did this intentionally, a learning health system as one that requires implementation, there's a science underlying implementation that's just as important as the science underlying information. And we need to be thinking about training implementationists as well as training informationists, and probably others. You might want to take a look at, here we go with the shameless commerce again, the graduate program that we started in my department, which is both a master's and a PhD program in health infrastructures and learning systems. And what we are trying to do in this program is to train the workforce that is needed to support the effort I just described to you. And the curriculum is a combination of information science, implementation science, ethics, and a few other things, basically what you need to know to support a learning cycle and to be familiar with all aspects of the infrastructural services that support them. So I would encourage you to think about, perhaps, if you want to move in this direction systematically, that the workforce you might need, with all the developments that are going on in informatics here, may be somewhat different from the workforce that will result from a focus on informatics alone.
Can I ask a similar question to the first one?
Oh, hi.
Which is, it's kind of about scale. So there's, we're trying to solve these national level problems that are systemic problems, and yet, as you said towards the end, it's critical that we start with small projects that are kind of manageable, that we can build these learning communities, or from these learning communities. So how do you span this gap between thinking about communities that are inherently small, that involve patients and families, and trying to get optimised health outcomes for individuals with system change? How do you think about bridging that?
Yeah, thanks. You've hit on a problem that keeps me up at night. I must confess. I don't. The honest answer to your question is I don't know. But I've thought about it a lot, and I do think that a very fruitful strategy would be to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think it was Chairman Mao who said that. And with the idea being that if there is a group at whatever level of scale that wants to come together and and form a community to address a problem, let them do that. Don't force a level of scale. We are starting our out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community at the level of 2 medium-sized counties in the U.S. There are 360 cardiac arrests a day in that area, enough to learn from. If it wasn't enough to learn from, if we weren't going to generate enough data, then we would have to scale up. But any learning community or learning cycle scaled to a size that when it studies itself will generate enough data to learn from over a reasonable period of time, I think that's a legitimate that's a legitimate starting point. And I wouldn't discourage anything from starting just because it's too small, as long as it's big enough to learn from with some credibility.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. One of the things that's kind of playing in my mind is the similarities between learning health systems and cluster theory. And clusters is something that I'm particularly interested in. And I've been reflecting a little bit on this idea that for clusters to work, you need backing from government and private sector and research community. So how important is the triple helix if we want these to be successful at a national level? Do you need all three players?
Yeah, you do. You do. What I'm describing here, and I hope I'm not, contradicting myself or sounding like I am, is a combination of bottom-up and harmonious top-down. With everyone who needs to be involved. I'm not familiar with cluster theory. Every time I give a talk like this, so I learned about something new I should learn about. So thank you for that. But if I understand what you're saying, the art of this is to let things happen from the bottom and support them and nurture them, while the official mechanisms of governance are kind of watching over them and in ways that respond to their particular needs, allow them to thrive. And how that fits into your theory, write to me and make me smarter. Thank you.
Over here again. You mentioned in your talk that your local health LHS systems should be centralised. I was wondering how, increasingly in the world we're getting into more decentralised systems, more distributed systems. I was wondering how your model would work in a system which is less centralised and more distributed.
Remind me of what I said should be centralised.
The LHS, one of the characteristics that was that it's centralised. It was one of your points on one of your slides.
I think I said it was decentralised.
Okay, I stand corrected. It said centralised on the form.
Oh, it did? If it did, I apologize.
That's
no,
what I
I meant it to say it was decentralised, and if I can't think of a more decentralized national level health system than the cacophony we have in the US. So achieving any kind of centralized approach to what I'm talking about would be completely incompatible with reality. It'll be interesting to watch the UK, whose National Health Service is of course much more centralized, and see how this works in a more centralized environment. So I apologize if there was a mistake on the slide.
I missed it myself. You're preaching to the choir. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about how you think measuring success, how to measure success as well, and how to set up those evaluations and measures without getting too lost in sort of making sure things are perfect, but also demonstrating some successes that people can share and I suppose get going quickly on.
Oh, okay, right, thank you. So one of the features of the learning cycle, as I've described it, is it's kind of self-documenting and self-evaluating. As I said, in the very first stage of performance to data, the learning community needs to establish at the very outset what are going to be the key metrics that define progress and ultimately success. And the first step then in P2D, or one of the first steps in P2D, is to document what the measurement result of those metrics is now. How well are we doing now? We know we're not doing well because we wouldn't be embarking on this if we thought we were doing well. Like I said, the key metric in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, there were lots of metrics, but the key metric is 8%. So as you cycle through, you are going to come back around to P2D a second time after you've discovered and made the changes that you were going to make, and experience the results of those changes, and you'll measure again at that point, presumably using the same measures and measurement methods that you use on the first cycle. So you have a clear indicator of whether things have gotten better, remained about the same, or gotten worse. In other words, as someone who's thought a lot about evaluating things for a long time, what's nice about this is the evaluation isn't an add-on. It's built in. The learning cycle is self-documenting. And if, as many places are doing now, they are doing implementation experiments, sometimes randomized experiments in that knowledge to performance stage. A randomized third are going to do it A, a randomized third are going to do it B, and a randomized third are going to do it C. You get something that will not only tell you where the amount of improvement that occurred in the aggregate, but also what approaches were more successful than others. So having spent many, many years before I discovered learning health systems trying to convince people to evaluate things, and in a formal way, particularly in informatics, where a lot of people didn't think it was necessary to evaluate the systems they developed, and it was always seen as an add-on. The fact that this is built in, that evaluation and study of progress is built into the cycle, I think is a real benefit.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Actually, looking at this, we work more in the physical therapy space, in the clinical side of things, and this is really how we evaluate our process. And unfortunately, we don't quite have the data to support it as much because we're still in the small space. And actually, what happens in our area is, again, a lot of this time, that data just gets produced and it's actually lagging behind the practice. So, for us, we really see something like this as what we want to create, because we work specifically with osteoarthritis. Like, how would you see a smaller body, independent clinics kind of tapping into bigger groups that would be interested in the research? Like, for us, we really want to tap into bigger groups, and it's hard for us to rally because it's almost like we're an independent commercial entity, whereas we see ourselves as this bigger group and we want to create these bodies, but it's just difficult to get that initial push.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're describing a universal challenge, and one for which, if you have a little patience, this learning community approach can be very effective to address this lag and this difficulty to actually make work what you think will generate the improvement that is desired. So I want to emphasize that building these learning communities requires a lot of sweat equity. These groups, you bring together people from, and I think I understood you saying, you have people from different places, different kinds of organizations, and they see the world differently. This can be extremely challenging and take time, and you might feel after you're 6 months into it and you've had several meetings and you're just starting to see the group form, or are convinced it's never going to form, oh, maybe this isn't going to work. But it does take time. There are techniques. In fact, we are writing a manual called Making Learning Communities Work. It's almost finished. Everything we've learned, a lot of it the hard way, about doing this. So I'll send Heiko a copy when it's ready, and you can get a copy from him.
Thank you.
So maybe sign up to the DHIN so that when this comes out, you can get it in the newsletter too. And Robin, you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question about governance and leadership. So I think the idea of these learning communities are fantastic, but at the end of the day, it's sort of an organic community process, and you get to the point, or that's been my experience, where governance starts rearing its head if you're going to get traction, a long-term traction, and then you need leadership, and then you start to get into what is a very non-learning health system type approach. And I just wondered what your practical experience was in terms of whether you reached this point where governance became more overriding than actually the learning health system itself.
Yeah, sure. And obviously I don't have an overarching principle here, but I think this is the point where you just have to be clever with the decisions you make and beware of the consequences, and perhaps learn from others who have had similar experiences. For example, perfect example of what you're talking about. So our out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community is about to start collecting survey data. Okay? Who owns that data? We have at least 14 different organizational entities represented in this learning community. And we had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago. A few of us say, okay, this is a very important decision. We could lose the whole thing right here if we make a wrong decision, or less severe, we could slow ourselves down significantly, because back to my nuclear example, if any of these groups walk out, the whole community could disintegrate. So we are putting a lot of thought into who should own, what should be the home organization for this learning community, and we've decided, and we're going to propose that the owner be the medical control district, the medical control authority for these two counties, and we're going to approach the board of the medical control authority. This is obviously just illustrative to be the home for this. And we're going to propose to everybody what everybody thinks is going to make sense to protect the privacy of the people who are contributing this information. We're going to use the Institutional Review Board of the university for this. So we're sort of distributing the governance, putting each piece of the governance where it can be best done and where any reasonable person would agree this is kind of the best entity to oversee this piece of it. So the details may not be relevant to your situation here, but the story is you almost have to divide this decision into pieces and give it a lot of thought. The answers are not obvious.
Chuck, we often talk about technology and solutions as being a way of bridging gaps and enabling traditionally underserved communities access to care that they otherwise may not have. But oftentimes the people who are invited to the co-design table, who are consulted in evaluations, whose voices are heard, are those who are educated and relatively well off. What advice do you have for including the voices of underserved communities in the learning communities that you're proposing?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm pleased to respond to it from a number of perspectives. You have to understand the cultures of the people who you want to feel included. So we have a faculty member in my department who is seeking to improve the lives of diabetics in underserved communities in Detroit, which has many, many underserved communities. And they are not using methods exactly what I'm talking about here, but very similar in several respects. And they've understood that in that culture, it's the churches who that are truly the glue that holds those societies together, and things that happen through the churches tend to have automatic legitimacy even among people who are not regular churchgoers. So what they have done is literally organized their interventions through about 20 churches. And that has turned what would have been something very, very difficult, both to communicate with people and also to convince them of the legitimacy of some of the interventions they are trying to improve diabetic control, into something that had automatic legitimacy, because the messages were coming from places that were respected in that culture. So it almost comes back to the answer I gave before to Robin's question. You've got to sort of hunker down and think really, really hard about what the cultures are and what the and what are the levers, the metaphoric levers you can pull, the social levers you can pull that would have legitimacy, and above all, promote communication. Because if you can't reach people and you can't communicate with them, or they won't listen, then not very much can be done. I do see this learning community approach, because of its all-inclusiveness, as an approach similar to the way they're self-evaluating and self-documenting are also automatically all-inclusive. So it's almost like if you don't take an all-inclusive approach, if you don't bring these underserved communities in to the extent that the problem engages them, which is almost always the case, you're violating a sort of a fundamental assumption. Still, it can be very hard to do, and which took me to this idea of being sure you understand the culture.
Hi, my name's Candice Donnelly. I'm a PhD student, and I'm looking at electronic medical records for quality measurement and improvement, so very relevant. And I just have a very quick question. If you have a top tip for trying to marry that top-down, bottom-up approach, how do you get that the governance to care about the same measures that people are passionate about at that ground level?
So you do a lot of things. One of them is you engage representatives of the upper levels in the community, at least in the early stages of the community, to be sure their viewpoints are integrated. It's also important to frame the problem of interest as a health problem and not an administrative problem. So in a lot of the work I've done, and this has come up frequently, the temptation is to use these methods to solve administrative problems, increase the number of people who do this, and lower the cost of doing that. And when a problem is framed as an administrative problem, it doesn't generate the same. It doesn't have that passion generating potential. So my point here is problems that are that promote the nucleation of a learning community ideally will be health problems. And if they are health problems, there almost always exist relatively uncontroversial metrics of the prevalence or acuity or of that problem that can be used. And for example, in the two examples I cited, or the three examples I've cited, we had remission rates for IBD, we had survival rates for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and we had severity and frequency of falls in nursing homes. Those may not be the only metrics that the learning community anchors on in measuring its success, but those sort of bedrock metrics are usually metrics that almost everybody agrees are important. So if you follow the formula that I was just describing, focus on a health problem whenever possible, use the commonly accepted measures of success for that health problem in addition to any that the community wants to sprinkle in. I think you avoid the concern that you quite reasonably put forward.
Thank you, Chuck. So
okay, thank you.